Hi, everybody. I wanted to just take a few minutes to offer a quick introduction to week 6. This week, we're going to look at neoplasticism, De Stijl, and the Bauhaus. Um, Sort of an interesting turn in the course in that we focus so much on painting to this point. And this week offers a look at, in addition to painting, some excursions into design and architecture. And I think that really sort of opens up the course in a particular way, which I'll talk about in a minute. So let's just sort of look at what we're up to this week. We have 2 slide lectures. It's really one lecture. It's just broken into 2 YouTube videos, right? So we have Utopian Visions and the Bauhaus, which the way the videos are broken up also reflects the Gompertz chapters, chapter 11 on neoplasticism and chapter 12 on the Bauhaus. Please also look at the short readings that are part of the week, the Bauhaus Manifesto and selections from Mondrian, on dialogue in the new plastic. We also have a journal, sorry, I have a little cold. We also have a journal response this week, which I'll get to in a minute as well. And there is no quiz this week. So your writing focus will be on the journal response. So let's talk a little bit about what we're up to right now. As the slide lecture presents, World War I was an incredibly devastating event in European history. And as artists are kind of working their way out of World War I, there's a real turn toward the idea of utopia. And I think the best way to describe what artists were after was to reinvent the world in a form that you could almost say was perhaps more pure or refined, that cleared away the old as much as possible to make way for new ideas. And it's pretty interesting because as we've seen the art movements evolve over the last 15 or 20 years, since about the turn of the century, you're seeing experiments where artists are always thinking that this is the one that gets at the kind of essential nature of art. So I think there's this desire for purity that's really big in terms of what they are after when they think about art as a utopian enterprise. Let me just read a little something that Mondrian says in the dialogue on the new plastic handout. He says, "People too often view the work of art as a luxury, something merely pleasant, even as a decoration, as something that lies outside of life. Yet art and life are one. Art and life are both expressions of truth." I think that last comment is really important. I think ultimately what all these art movements drive toward is a notion of truth. So if the world itself, the chaos of the world, the historical world that we live in, feels disappointing or feels chaotic or tumultuous, at least art is a place where life can be lived with a greater sense of purity and truth. So I just want to really emphasize, I want you to understand how important that is. Also, Gompertz says on page 189, I think it is, he says that artists were experimenting with, oh no, okay, I'm sorry, let me just back up a little bit. He says on page 129 that Mondrian is really interested in this idea of the plastic. Be careful, don't misunderstand that as like plastic, like as in plastic material, like plastic bags. What he's really talking about is the malleability of form, right? And by thinking about the idea of a new plasticism, neoplasticism, the idea is how can art materials be used, how can art be conceptualized in a way that is utterly and completely new. And for him, it's ultimately ridding the artwork of the recognizable object in order to get to a non-objective way of looking at art, free from representation of the natural world. Gompertz also talks about how Mondrian and other artists were interested in a religious movement called Theosophy. There were a number of these kinds of emerging, what now we might call New Age religions that artists were invested in. I just want to emphasize that because there's something behind this desire, right, to see the world in a different way. And I think in many ways the kinds of practice that artists are invested in this particular series of lectures this week is a kind of spirituality that comes out of art practice itself, whether it's fine arts expression or design. Okay, so as for architecture, I just want to be clear. I hope you recognize that this lecture is going to encompass everything from American architecture from the 1870s and 80s on, with figures like Louis Sullivan, through the Bauhaus and into modernist architects like Mies van der Rohe, who emigrate to the United States with World War II and bring modern architecture to a modernist kind of architecture that comes out of the Bauhaus tradition to the United States. This is important because with war, what often happens is you have refugees of war who will leave a war-torn area and come to a place like the United States where warfare was not happening, even though the U.S. obviously was involved in World War II. So when you bring sort of the great intellectuals and artists from Europe, they come to the United States and they change American artistic culture as a result. But think about the architecture along the same ways. These early skyscraper experiments in places like New York and Chicago were primarily experiments in ridding architecture of unnecessary decoration. But the impetus behind that was just almost very, very capitalistic, right? Just make a building as basic as it can in order to perform the function that you need it to perform. The buildings could be taller because of the invention of the elevator, and frankly, they did not need to be particularly ornate. In Europe, I think the spirit is slightly different, right? It's about ridding form of anything that's unnecessary as a way to get to kind of more of a spiritual purity. So there's a little tension there between American art and its interest in sort of capitalist ideas and European art and its interest in spiritual ideas. Okay, so there's also this nice video on Gerhard Rietveld, the Schroeder House, which still looks strikingly, startlingly modern. I mean, if this was built today, I think we would feel in some ways that it's really present in terms of the contemporary age we live in, which says a lot about the fact that in some ways art has not changed that much in 100 years. So where art was so startlingly new in 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, something seems to happen in our own time where the change is not as apparent. This nice little video on the Bauhaus, please check that out. That's really good in terms of explaining the tenets of the art school that was the Bauhaus, as well as some of the architectural elements of it. And then there's the Bauhaus Manifesto and Mondrian's selections. So now let's just talk about this down here, the journal's response for the week. The idea is to choose an object or a building in your surroundings, so something you have access to, not from a book, but something physical in the world. Something that exemplifies the concepts and aesthetic principles of neoplasticism or the Bauhaus. Describe it first, then try to connect this example to the ideas discussed this week. Be sure to articulate how and why the object or building appears to uphold the ideals of these utopian movements in early 20th century art and architecture. Be sure to explain these ideals and connect them to the building or the object. So your task this week is to find a building, a piece of furniture, a decorative object, something that you think is representative of the principles of neoplasticism, or of the Bauhaus. And the idea is to see where these principles are either present in contemporary objects, buildings, objects that have been built recently or created recently, or that you find something, say, out of history that you have access to, then you talk about how those principles apply to it. So you really do need to know what the principles are, and you need to be able to make connections to that building or object. All right, I just wanted to put these, just want to show you a couple of photographs. Look at this. I just think this is so interesting. This is a photograph of 1920s Paris. All right, and here's another one. And really the idea was just to say, look how this is potentially what we think of as the 1920s, right? Like the Model T style car, people on bicycles, black and white. Look how remarkably modern these experiments in design and architecture are in comparison to what we normally think of as the way the world looked in the 1920s. So I just think, we would, like I said, we would walk in the Schroeder House today and still say, wow, this is really, really contemporary with regard to the way space is laid out, the simplicity of it, the minimalism of it. Can you imagine what it looked like to somebody in the 1920s? Okay, well, that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoy the week. Please work hard on those journal entries and really think about the kinds of things we've been talking about with regard to visual analysis, all the components of a good analysis. Think hard on my feedback to you. I see improvement every week in terms of how you are digging deeper into visual analysis, becoming more clear and more articulate. You're able to make greater connections. You can always drop me an email if you have any questions, and I'm happy to get back to you. Sorry about the issue with the quiz this week. I still don't fully understand what was wrong with it, but we don't have a quiz this week, so that shouldn't be a problem. I'm going to be in touch with Blackboard help at the college and look through all our settings from this point forward so that doesn't happen again. All right, everybody, have a great week, and I'll look forward to seeing your work on your journals later this week.